Hello everyone! Today we are going to talk about bad faith deals. A prime example of this activity is the Treaty of 1871, in which we find a perfect example of activity that looks suspiciously like money laundering. A certain transfer of monies was conducted between the British government in the name of the British Empire and the United States. This had a great impact on international law. Under the treaty, the United States paid $5,500,000, according to this article, and the United States was in turn given $15,500,000. Basically, a lot of money changed hands following the so-called U.S. Civil War. Now, a curious and obscure word, which can help us understand this subject a little better, is the word snaphain, which I am probably pronouncing incorrectly, as it is I believe, Danish word. Now, it appears to be primarily used in reference to resistance forces during Swedish occupation of Denmark. However, on the Wikipedia article, it states that, quote, a final category of snaphanar was bandits, looters, and carpetbaggers who roamed the land and had little to do with either warring party. Their looting was directed at the Swedish army and to a greater extent at the civilian population. The sources show that there were criminals on both sides who exploited the local population in a shameful way. Therefore, snaphanar is probably synonymous with criminal. The word contrabandist, or contrabandista in Espanol and Spanish, refers to someone that carries contraband and is equivalent to the word smuggler. However, a word that is mostly applied one-sidedly and derogatorily is the word barbarian, as in the Barbary Coast or the Barbary Corsairs. Now, another word, shipwreckers, refers to people that would allegedly lead ships astray and then rob them, which makes a lot of sense when you're dealing with an age of monopolies, piracy, and a world of despots. Now, Viking is a word that is often misapplied but is generally considered synonymous with raider, although it is also used to describe a people group incorrectly. However, a privateer is nothing short than a word to diminish the label of pirate, meaning a privateer is used as somebody who is acting on the behalf of under the color of law, such as Francis Drake. However, a privateer is nothing more than a legal pirate. And this takes us into the realm of carefully constructed fictions, as most of the historical pirate stories are, which is incredibly obvious in the rampant use of beard colors as a label. Now, in the Levantine Adventure, The Travels and Missions of the Chevalier d'Arvaux, 1653 to 1697, by Warren H. Lewis, we find a useful passage talking about the smuggling trade. Quote, but in spite of the numerous backsliders, the obligation to abstain from alcohol was pretty generally recognized and often enforced, particularly in that headquarters of orthodoxy, the imperial seraglio. One result of this was the buildup of a profitable but very dangerous traffic in smuggling liquor into the Sultan's palace from Marmora, a nearby island which produced an excellent wine and where 3/4 of the people were heavy drinkers. In 1672, a smuggler was caught red-handed in this business. He had made for him a small trunk, which was in fact a tank filled with wine, and with it on his shoulders was in the habit of visiting customers in the seraglio disguised as a street porter. But his too frequent appearances at last attracted the attention of a suspicious eunuch who insisted on opening the supposed trunk. The murder was out, and instantly the porter was thrown on his face and given 500 strokes of the cane with a promise of strangling if he ever again showed his face at the palace gates. End quote. This shows us an example of how the trade in the Levant, the smuggling trade in the Levant, was conducted. Now, in the splendid century, Life in the France of Louis XIV, also by Warren H. Lewis, we find a different passage talking about the practical nature of smuggling. Quote, of the other forms of direct taxation, the gabelle or salt tax was probably the most onerous and certainly one of the most expensive to collect. And as everywhere in Ancien Regime finance, we find here too a complete lack of uniformity. For purposes of gabelle, The country was divided into 5 classes, ranging from the Grand Gavel, generalities, where every inhabitant was compelled every year to buy an excessive quantity of bad salt at an exorbitant price, to the Pays des Sauniers, or salt-producing areas, where he was not allowed to buy sufficient for his own domestic consumption. The latter restriction was imposed in a fruitless attempt to check salt smuggling, one of the major industries of Old France, which involved Louis in the maintenance of a sort of customs army. The maréchaussée, which not infrequently fought regular pitched battles with the smugglers. Ferocious penalties were of course enacted against smugglers, the faux seigneurs as they are called. But under the Ancien regime, it was considerably easier to promulgate a law than to get it obeyed, especially when, as in the case, public sympathy was on the side of the lawbreaker, perhaps even a degree of official sympathy, if we are to judge from one recorded case. The local smugglers were camped in a wood on the outskirts of a certain village. When the maréchaussée entered the village, a quick-witted villager sounded the parish bell. The smugglers decamped, and the maréchaussée lost its prey. The obstructive villagers had rendered themselves liable to exemplary punishment. The customs complained to the intendant, and he in due course gave sentence. The village bell was to be dismounted, placed in the street, and there flogged by the hangman in the presence of the whole village." End quote. Now, this gives us an idea of why the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States was written in, quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Of course, this would also call into context the idea of merchantmen being armed and thus providing their own escort defense rather than paying security, which would just turn around and rob them, or depending on the navies. A merchantman supplying his own arms for a boat would be better outfitted than a navy depending on the incapable system of taxation, or rather extortion.